Ever heard of the murder of Kitty Genovese? Wondered why, in a city that never sleeps, a woman's desperate plea for help went unheard? Unravel the chilling secret of a night that silenced New York. Now, as we prepare to dive into our story, make sure you're comfortable. Are you ready? It's story time. The city was a beacon, a shimmering sea of possibilities. New York, that maddening, magical beast of steel and smoke, hummed with a life of its own. A throbbing pulse of jazz and car horns, the neon jungle of the 60s, with dreams hanging in the air like the smoke from 1,000 cigarettes. Amidst the labyrinth of cobbled streets and towering skyscrapers, secrets nestled in shadowy corners and hid in the glow of corner streetlights. Life rushed on in a colorful blur, a barrage of images that held a hypnotic allure. Bright marquee lights and hazy bars, horn-rimmed glasses reflecting the blinding billboards of Times Square, the screech of subway cars, the distant melodies of a saxophone from a corner jazz club, the aroma of hot dogs from the street carts mingling with the city's smog. It was a symphony of sights, sounds, and smells, a living, breathing entity that swallowed you whole and spat you out, leaving an indelible mark on your soul. Yet beneath the city's glamour, its pulsating rhythm and unyielding charm, an undercurrent of tension ran like an unseen river. It was a city that never slept, and with the darkness, its true character unfurled. The shadows lengthened, the alleys whispered secrets, and the city's glowing veneer gave way to a grittier reality. New York was a paradox, an enigma, and yet it held an irresistible allure. It was a city of dreams, but also of despair. It was the city of love, but also of loneliness. Every soul that walked its streets, every dreamer, every lost soul, every lover, every artist, they all danced to the city's complex tune. They all held a piece of the city's heart and bore its mark upon their own. They all, in their own way, contributed to the ever-turning wheel of life that was New York City. Against the pulsating backdrop of New York's nightlife, in a corner of the city that never slept, was a bar known as Ev's 11th Hour. It was the sort of place where locals and lost souls found refuge from the city's relentless pace. And amidst the symphony of clinking glasses and hushed conversations, Kitty Genovese, a flame-haired dynamo, was its beating heart. With an infectious laugh that livened up even the dreariest of nights and a spirit as vibrant as the city itself, Kitty held the reins of the bustling bar. Her hands danced over the rows of gleaming glasses and bottles as she served drink after drink to the array of patrons who filled the bar, from the ruffled businessmen unwinding after a long day to the nocturnal creatures basking in the smoky refuge from the outside world. These late-night customers had become more than faces across the bar. They were her friends. The shared stories, the whispered secrets, the laughter and the shared silences, they all wove a tapestry of camaraderie that stretched across the smoky haze of the bar. Kitty was the catalyst, the common thread that bound them all. In the intimate glow of the bar lights, she relished these connections, these stolen fragments of other lives that intertwined with her own. She reveled in the warmth of shared stories and secret smiles, the familiar routine of pouring drinks and sharing in the collective soul of the city at its most vulnerable, its most honest. But beneath her bright smile and the radiant energy she exuded, there was an undeniable undercurrent of weariness. The late hours, the weight of 1,000 stories, the relentless rhythm of the city that demanded so much, they all left their mark. And as the night wore on, shadows seemed to creep into the corners of the bar, subtly shifting the atmosphere, hinting at the darker side of the city's relentless pulse. As the clock ticked closer to the 11th hour, Kitty's eyes held a flicker of something more, a subtle echo of the city's own dual nature, a cocktail of joy and fatigue, of love for her job, and a yearning for some respite. And as the last patron staggered out into the early morning, Kitty was left alone in the quiet aftermath, the echoes of laughter still lingering in the air. The bar lights dimmed, casting long, dancing shadows that spoke of untold tales waiting in the wings. The neon lights of Ev's 11th hour receded in the rearview mirror as Kitty Genovese's car slipped into the river of traffic flowing through the arteries of the sleeping city. Her red Fiat was a speck of vibrancy amidst the monochrome sedans, a pulsating beat keeping rhythm with the city's nocturnal heartbeat. As she navigated the deserted streets, the cityscape rolling past in a muted blur of concrete and steel, a prickling sensation trickled down her spine. In the emptiness of the hour, another pair of headlights had appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, they seemed to be just another anonymous part of the city's landscape, twinkling like distant stars in the darkened glass. But as she turned down one street, then another, the same persistent glow kept pace. An unshakable echo in the city's symphony, an undefined silhouette etched against the city's sodium glow, stalking her in the labyrinth of midnight New York. The creeping unease flitted across her mind, whispering insidious doubts. Was she being followed? Was there a shadow looming larger in her life than the benign darkness of the city's night? Her heart fluttered in her chest, the rhythm of its beating quickening, matching the sudden urgency in the car's purring engine. But Kitty was a child of New York, molded by its character, shaped by its constant hum of life. She shook off the unsettled feeling, laughing softly at her own paranoia. The city had a way of spinning stories in the dark, of turning every stranger into a specter, every sound into a sinister whisper. It was easy to let the imagination run wild in the shadowy depths of the city nights. With a dismissive shake of her head, Kitty cranked up the radio, letting the soothing tunes fill the car, battling the creeping silence outside. It was just another night in the city that never slept, and the shadows that danced in the corners of her eyes were merely the remnants of a day lived on the edge of dreams and reality. The Fiat grumbled to a stop outside her apartment, the engine's purr dying down to a soft whisper. The street was bathed in a sickly yellow glow from the sparse lampposts, their light barely piercing the thick quilt of darkness. Kitty stepped out of her car, the chill of the night nipping at her bare arms. The familiar silhouette of her apartment building loomed ahead, a solitary giant standing vigil amidst the city's incessant slumber. The comforting thought of her small abode, of warm blankets and a night's rest, beckoned her. As she moved towards the building, she felt it again, the prickling sensation, like tiny ants marching down her spine. A shiver rippled through her, a pebble dropped in the calm pond of the night. The sensation of being watched bore into her, an unseen gaze that felt almost tangible in the frigid air. Her heartbeat quickened, its staccato rhythm a stark contrast to the silence that hung in the air. Each click of her heels against the pavement echoed ominously, a haunting metronome in the dead of night. She could almost feel eyes on her, tracking her every movement from the shadowy depths of the city. But Kitty shrugged it off, attributing the growing dread to the night's fatigue, the weariness that seeped into her bones. It was the city's song of paranoia, an anthem every New Yorker knew by heart. The shadows, after all, held the power to distort, to mold the mundane into the macabre. She continued on, the echo of her footsteps the only evidence of her journey. Pulling her coat tighter around her, she quickened her pace, the keys jingling in her trembling hand. She laughed softly to herself, chiding her own flight of imagination as her home beckoned her in, a sanctuary against the city's unnerving whispers. Just as she reached the entrance, the world twisted into a nightmare. From the amorphous shadows, a figure emerged, an eruption of menace in the tranquil night. It happened in the space of a heartbeat. One moment she was standing on the precipice of safety, the next, she was plunged into a chilling abyss. The sudden attack was brutal and swift, like a predator pouncing on its unsuspecting prey. A gasp tore from Kitty's throat, her keys clattering onto the concrete as the phantom from her paranoia materialized into a terrifying reality. A primal fear, raw and potent, swept over her. It coursed through her veins, sent her heart racing, her breath hitching. It was the kind of terror that froze the blood in your veins, that turned your legs to jelly. But even as the fear threatened to engulf her, there was a spark in Kitty, a flame that refused to be snuffed out. In the face of danger, she found a reserve of strength she hadn't known existed. Her adrenaline-fueled systems spurred her into action. There was a wildness in her eyes, a ferocious will to survive. The shadow of dread that had stalked her night had crossed into her world, but she would not let it claim her without a fight. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to resist, to push back against the horror that sought to drag her into the night's dark abyss. Her hands, though shaking, balled into fists. Her voice, though strangled by fear, strained to break free. She could feel the beast of fear gnawing at her, but she would not let it consume her. Her spirit, though shaken, refused to shatter. Her will, though tested, refused to buckle. She was Kitty Genovese, a fiery beacon amidst the city's ebb and flow, and she would not go down without a fight. Her instincts took over. Kitty fought back, her movements frantic and desperate. Her fingers clawed at the air, seeking purchase on the formless entity assaulting her. She kicked, squirmed, used every ounce of her strength to fend off the shadowy figure. Her voice found its escape then, breaking the chains of fear that had held it captive. A guttural scream ripped from her throat, shattering the silence, a chilling cry that echoed through the empty streets. Again and again she screamed, the sound sharp and shrill against the quiet backdrop of the night. "Help!" she cried out, her voice carrying the weight of her terror, her desperation. "Help me!" The city that never slept seemed to hold its breath. The cacophony of its existence was silenced, replaced by the haunting echo of her pleas. Each scream, each call for help seemed to reverberate, a ghostly symphony that etched itself into the city's concrete veins. But as the minutes dragged on, her screams dwindling into hoarse cries, the cruel reality set in. She was alone. The same city that had cradled her in its vibrant arms now turned a deaf ear to her pleas. The buildings that once teemed with life stood as silent witnesses to her struggle, their darkened windows reflecting her ordeal in a grotesque dance of shadows. Her heart pounded, a lone drum in the silent orchestra of the night. Her screams echoed unanswered, each cry chipping away at her dwindling hope. The bustling metropolis that had promised companionship now bore down on her with an overwhelming sense of solitude. Kitty Genovese was alone with her fear and the specter of death that loomed ever closer. The realization was as cold as the night air, a chilling affirmation of her isolation in the heart of a city bursting at its seams. Somewhere above, in the concrete maze that towered over the chilling scene, a window was drawn back. Behind the pane was a face, pallid in the jaundiced glow of a solitary table lamp. A man stood there, his eyes wide with disbelief, riveted to the horror playing out in the alleyway below. He was an ordinary man, steeped in the humdrum rhythm of city life. He was one of the countless faces lost in the crowd, nameless and insignificant, until fate thrust him into the role of an unwilling spectator in Kitty's battle for survival. His heart pounded in his chest, the echo of Kitty's screams still ringing in his ears. His fingers tightened around the drapes, his knuckles paling with the pressure. A shudder ran through him, a ghost of the fear that gripped the woman below. A myriad of emotions warred within him. He felt fear, yes, but there was also a strong undercurrent of guilt. A haunting indecision took root in his mind, a gnawing question that loomed like a specter. Should he interfere, or should he, like the city, remain a silent spectator? Time seemed to stretch into eternity, each second heavy with the woman's terror-filled cries. He wavered on the brink of action, his mind a whirl of uncertainty. Every rational instinct warned him against getting involved, yet a nagging conscience urged him to step in. In the end, self-preservation prevailed. With one last haunted look at the scene unfolding beneath him, he let the drapes fall back into place. The window shut with an echoing finality, severing the chilling connection between the spectator and the spectacle. His decision was made. He chose to turn away, to retreat into the oblivious safety of his home, leaving Kitty to her grim fate. He was a silent witness, a representation of the city's apathy, an embodiment of the bystander effect that would come to define this night of horror. In the shadows, the sinister figure of her assailant drew back. Perhaps he was deterred by the echo of her desperate cries, or maybe he was content to watch her fear grow, feeding off her dread like some malevolent specter. Regardless, Mosley vanished back into the darkness from which he had sprung, leaving Kitty battered, bloody, but alive. A heavy silence settled over the alleyway, broken only by the ragged gasps that ripped from Kitty's throat. Her body screamed in protest, a symphony of pain echoing through her every nerve. Yet as she lay there in the cold grip of fear, a flicker of determination ignited within her. She wouldn't give in. Not now. Not like this. Summoning every ounce of strength that remained, Kitty pushed herself up from the pavement. Her legs wobbled, threatening to give way under her, but the raw adrenaline coursing through her veins steeled her resolve. She moved, each step an agonizing effort, a testament to her will to survive. Blood seeped from her wounds, staining the cold pavement beneath her, but she paid it no mind. Her singular focus was on seeking help, on escaping the darkened labyrinth that had become her nightmare. She stumbled forward, her heart pounding against her ribcage in time with the rapid tattoo of her heels against the asphalt. The eerie quiet was disturbed only by her labored breathing and the distant wail of a lonely siren somewhere far off. The city seemed oblivious to her plight, its vibrant energy muted, indifferent to the horror playing out in its underbelly. Kitty moved, her fear giving way to determination, her pain dulled by adrenaline. She was a wounded animal, but she was a fighter, refusing to let the predator lurking in the shadows claim an easy victory. Just when she believed she might escape, the darkness coalesced into a figure once more. It was him, back from the shadows, his eyes glinting with a cruel determination. The phantom fear that had been pursuing her manifested again, but this time it was more brutal, more relentless. Her breath hitched as the assailant lunged at her, the beast unleashed fully. His presence was overwhelming, a violent storm bent on destruction. Every instinct in Kitty screamed at her to run, to escape, but she was trapped, cornered by the embodiment of her nightmare. Her attacker was ruthless, his attacks fueled by an unhinged frenzy that knew no reason, no restraint. Kitty could feel her strength wane with each brutal hit, each terrifyingly close brush with the finality of her life. But she was not done. Not yet. Driven by raw terror and an unyielding desire to survive, Kitty fought back. Her fists flew, battering against the monstrous form that loomed over her. Her nails scraped at any piece of flesh they could find, her feet kicking and struggling in the desperate dance of survival. Her screams shattered the stillness of the night, echoing off the walls of the desolate buildings that bore silent witness to her struggle. Each call for help was a plea, a desperate bid to stir the heart of the city she once believed to be alive with humanity. But the city remained indifferent, its heart hardened to her cries. With every passing moment, her resilience was stretched thin, like a wire pulled taut to its breaking point. She could feel the familiar sting of fatigue clawing at her, trying to pull her into a void where there would be no pain, no fear. Yet she continued to fight, her spirit as unbroken as her repeated calls for help. Her screams echoed on, a chilling melody in the symphony of the night. But with each note, a horrifying truth became apparent. Despite the noise, despite the struggle, despite the desperate pleas, she was alone. In the cold solitude of her apartment, Mrs. Jacobs observed the horror unfold from the keyhole of her door, fear rooting her to the spot. Her heartbeat hammered in her ears as she watched the brutality play out in the narrow field of her vision. A hand clamped over her mouth to keep the screams of terror from escaping her lips. Yet as Kitty's pleas pierced through the otherwise tranquil night, Mrs. Jacobs remained still, a silent spectator in the theater of her fear. Across the hallway, a heated debate raged in the Mitchell household. Mr. Mitchell held the phone in his hand, his wife pleading with him to dial the numbers. The terror-stricken screams reverberated off the walls, punctuating their argument. Yet the indecision kept them immobile, their concerns for their own safety becoming a barrier stronger than the walls around them. Somewhere in the same building, Mr. Barnes glanced out the window, his attention drawn by the commotion. He saw Kitty, saw the man that towered over her. His brows furrowed in momentary concern before he shook his head, convincing himself it was none of his business. It was just another city altercation, he told himself, just another disturbance in a city that never slept. Together, they formed a silent chorus of inaction, each justifying their refusal to interfere in their own ways. Yet beneath their individual reasons lay a shared, terrifying truth, the bystander effect. Despite their numbers, despite the palpable horror that stirred their conscience, they chose to look away, their inaction hanging heavy in the night air. A young woman fought a losing battle in their midst, her cries echoing their silence back at them. Yet they remained as they were, their reluctance becoming the horrifying puzzle piece at the center of this tragedy. A woman screamed, and the city didn't stir. In the cold heart of Kew Gardens, Kitty's strength waned. The oppressive weight of her reality pushed her down, her body worn and torn from the struggle. Yet, she continued to cling to the fleeting hope of salvation, her life force burning brightly in the encroaching darkness. With each passing second, her cries became weaker, her pleas for help gradually softening into mere whispers against the harsh wind. The concrete was cold against her back, her fingertips tracing the gritty texture as she lay there, alone. A chilling thought seeped into her consciousness, freezing her blood, a revelation far more terrifying than the shadowy figure that loomed over her. Help wasn't coming. The realization hit her harder than any physical blow, severing the final thread of hope she'd been clinging to. Her eyes fluttered shut, her hand slowly dropping to the ground. The fight left her, evaporating like a wisp of smoke in the wind. She wasn't a person anymore, not to them. Just another cry in the night, another faceless victim in a city that had seen far too many. Then there was silence. An eerie stillness that blanketed the scene of the crime, the echoes of her screams lingering in the frigid night air. The bustling city fell quiet, as if holding its breath, bearing witness to the stark, haunting aftermath of the violence that had just unfolded. And there, beneath the indifferent stars, Kitty Genovese breathed her last, her life slipping away unnoticed in the heart of a city that had let her down. The wailing sirens cut through the eerie silence of the night, their harsh sound reverberating off the cold, indifferent buildings. The police arrived, their vehicles hastily parked, doors left ajar in the rush. Under the harsh glow of their lights, they stumbled upon the dreadful tableau. A young woman, lifeless on the cold pavement, the sinister artwork of a faceless killer. They moved with frantic urgency, scouring the scene for any trace of the perpetrator, their disbelief palpable as they observed the chillingly quiet apartments, their windows overlooking the crime scene. 38 witnesses, one officer muttered, his voice a grim whisper in the quiet night, and not a single call. Each piece of evidence gathered, each statement taken, painted a horrifying picture of collective inaction, a community of bystanders. The seasoned detectives exchanged uneasy glances, their usual stoicism replaced with a heavy sense of dread. They were experienced men, hardened by the harsh realities of their profession. They'd seen the worst the city had to offer, but this was different. This was an unfathomable depth of apathy, a terrifying revelation of humanity's capacity for indifference. As the night drew on, they pieced together the timeline, retracing Kitty's final steps. The unanswered cries for help echoed in their minds, amplifying the grim reality of her last moments. Their faces were etched with a shared understanding. They were not just dealing with a murder, they were uncovering a societal disease. The harsh buzz of their radios cut through their thoughts, reporting another crime in some distant part of the city. The detectives exchanged one final glance at the silent apartments before stepping back into their cars, the flickering image of Kitty Genovese forever seared into their minds. The dawn arrived like a reluctant spectator, bringing with it the piercing reality of Kitty's demise. The news rippled across the city, spreading with the morning light. Front pages screamed the gruesome tale, a young woman attacked, her desperate pleas for help unanswered. Radio waves carried Kitty's story into every home, every store, every car, every corner of the city that had until then remained blissfully ignorant. And with each telling and retelling, the city stirred, a collective gasp escaping its millions of inhabitants. Among them were Kitty's friends and family. Those who had known her laughter, her spirit, now grappled with her sudden absence. The patrons of Ev's 11th hour bar, accustomed to her warm smile and quick wit, were greeted instead with hushed tones and sorrowful faces. Her regulars sat quietly, their usually jovial banter replaced by a heavy silence. Her family, woken by the dreadful phone call every family fears, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy. Her brother's voice shook as he answered the phone, the words from the other end blurring into a nightmare he desperately wished he could wake up from. Each friend, each relative, faced their own battle to reconcile the Kitty they knew with the victim the city mourned. They could not fathom her final moments, could not comprehend the terrifying loneliness she must have felt. Their loss was not just in her death, but in the damning revelation of her solitude in her most desperate hour. In this state of shock and despair, they began to navigate their grief, their fond memories of Kitty now tainted by the haunting image of her demise. The city was awake, and with its awakening, the mourning began. As the shock of Kitty's demise receded, replaced by a throbbing, persistent ache, another revelation began to stir in the city's consciousness: the silence of the witnesses. 38 pairs of eyes, the newspapers cried. 38 souls who had heard Kitty's pleas and done nothing. From coffee shop discussions to heated debates on television, the city turned its gaze inwards, dissecting its own indifference. The inaction of the witnesses wasn't just their failure, it was a chilling reflection of the city's own apathy. Mothers and fathers asked themselves what they would have done, their answers often falling into uncomfortable silence. Friends argued over hypotheticals, each insisting they would have acted, their voices revealing the doubts they tried to suppress. And from the depths of this collective guilt emerged a new kind of fear. If it had been their screams shattering the night, would the city have responded? Or would they too have been swallowed by the darkness, their pleas echoing off the city's indifferent facades? The pain of Kitty's loss was no longer confined to her loved ones. It had seeped into the city's bones, a ghost that haunted its streets, its homes, its dreams. A horrifying question hung in the air, whispered in alleyways, scrawled on subway walls. Are we all just bystanders? The city grappled with its guilt, each citizen wrestling with their personal demons of indifference and inaction. The echoes of Kitty's desperate cries had not just revealed the murderer in their midst, but also the bystanders within themselves. In the bleak aftermath of Kitty's death, the silence of her death gave way to a resounding clamor for change. The haunting specter of Kitty's unanswered pleas echoed in the halls of power, stirring the nation from its slumber. Out of this outcry came a lifeline in the dark, a 3-digit beacon of hope: 911. The establishment of this emergency number offered the promise of a quick response, a potential safeguard against the repeating of Kitty's tragic fate. The unforgiving concrete of New York had been stained with her blood, but it also became the bedrock for a system that sought to ensure help was but a call away. But the establishment of the emergency system was not the only legacy of Kitty's murder. As psychologists delved into the perplexing behavior of the 38 witnesses, they identified a chilling phenomenon: the bystander effect. The term entered public discourse, a chilling reminder of a night when empathy fell silent and indifference rang loud. Kitty Genovese's life was cruelly cut short, but her death echoed throughout the nation. Her story was a heartbreaking mystery, a narrative of betrayal by those who could have acted but chose not to. But her legacy was a catalyst for change, a rallying cry against apathy. And thus, the city moved on, bearing the scars of one dreadful night, haunted by the echoes of a tragedy that forever changed its soul. The tale of Kitty Genovese ended not with a whimper, but a thunderous call for a better world. In the end, the city remained the same as it always was, teeming with life, dreams, despair, and redemption. But somewhere in its collective heart, it held a space for Kitty, the woman who in death taught it the value of empathy, the price of silence, and the power of action. As our story comes to a close, let the lull of this soothing ambiance continue to cradle you further into your journey of calmness and rest. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your relaxation and sleep routine tonight. Remember, each day brings a new story, and each night brings a fresh chance to regenerate, to dream, and to become more of who you are. Good night, dear listener. Until our next story, sleep well and dream beautifully.